Thank you, everyone. I can see people are starting to assemble. Welcome. We're going to slow roll into this to make sure everybody gets in okay. Uh, Thank you again for joining us. We're going to start in just a minute. There's a poll popping up. If everybody could start to answer that, and we'll begin in just a couple of seconds. I can see the numbers ticking up. We've got maybe better than 100 folks on already. There were 1,000 people registered for today's conversation. So just giving it another couple of seconds while people enter the room. All right. Well, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today for Equity Matters. Our conversation today is about philanthropy in the crosshairs, confronting the perpetual backlash against justice and democracy. My name is Wendy Chun-Hoon. I'm the president and executive director of the Center for Law and Social Policy. And I am just grateful to be with you all today as we examine one of the most consequential challenges of our time. Equity Matters is not just a webinar. I wanted to start with that. It's really a space for courageous leaders to come together at a moment when philanthropy, which is a very powerful vehicle that has historically supported civil rights and community power building and democratic participation, now has the chance to courageously respond to a really coordinated political backlash that is ultimately designed to suppress justice work and silence the communities that are most harmed by inequity. And so this whole conversation is curated to help us all understand exactly what's happening, why it matters, and what we've got to do together to meet this specific moment with clarity and resolve. Today, we're going to hear from leaders whose organizations are on the front lines of advancing racial and economic justice. They're navigating political pressure, legal threats at times, reputational risk, and the chilling effects that are currently reshaping philanthropic decision-making. Their experiences are rooted in community, in movement work, governance work, democracy, narrative strategy, and they'll help guide us as we discuss what courageous, justice-driven giving looks like when democracy itself is under strain. Before we get started, I want to take a moment to uplift CLASP's deep partnership with philanthropy, which has helped us model what we believe is much needed across the field. Foundations have invested in the Center for Law and Social Policy's work not only because of our policy expertise, but because we actually share a value, for example, about prioritizing the leadership of folks experiencing poverty and making sure that those folks and their experiences are informing our work. And we jointly understand that this kind of critical capacity requires investment of time, investment of resources, and that's part of what trust-based philanthropy represents. And so through partners like it's hard to mention a few because then you want to mention everybody, but Vivian Sang and the Foundation for Child Development, and through collaboration with Neo Philanthropy, who you'll get to hear from in a bit, we've been able to co-create narrative strategies such as a national initiative that's reframing immigrants as essential assets to our communities that actually bring new constituencies together and make space for new power building. And these partnerships show what becomes possible when funders invest in relationships and in trust and in that kind of shared learning. Before we dive in, just going to take a moment to talk about how we'll use the chat during today's conversation. We see the chat as part of our community building together. And so it's really a space where you can reflect. I see people already chatting in, where you can affirm what you hear being shared and also really connect with others who care about these issues. A couple of guidelines so that the space works well for all of us. Please use the chat to share your reflections, words of encouragement, any resources that you think others might find useful. If you have a question for the speakers, and I'm going to remind you a couple of times throughout the conversation, we ask that you use the Q&A box instead. So two different functions. And that way we can be sure that your question is seen and lifted up. So for questions that you want to pose the speakers, and we'll pause for a couple of those throughout, use the Q&A box. We also just want to remain a respectful and welcoming space for all participants. And so we ask that your comments actually reflect that spirit. We like to think of the chat and have seen this in the prior Equity Matters conversations as kind of a collective call and response. So it's a way for you to bring your voice and energy into the conversation alongside our speakers. So we encourage you to join in. All right. For many of you who joined very early, we had a poll pop up. We're going to get that poll up on the screen again for folks to complete. We just want to know a little bit about who's in the room. So take a moment, if you can, to respond. We'll come back in and share some reflections. Thanks to everybody who's chatting in who you are, where you're from. We've got a good mix of folks in the room. So maybe for time's sake, we should close the poll and just know that we've got a real cross-section of leaders, philanthropic practitioners. We've got community organizers. I saw a lot of researchers joining, government partners, advocates, movement builders, and that really underscores why today's conversation is so necessary. This diversity that's represented here is a testament to the multiracial democracy that we're fighting so hard to protect right now. And it shows the range of institutions that are being pressured right now to retreat from equity. So we're here in a moment when attacks on diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, attacks on civil rights, human rights, public participation are neither isolated nor symbolic. They're a part of a coordinated strategy to narrow actually who gets to belong, right? Who gets to participate, who gets to define our future. And these attacks seek to limit the very kinds of philanthropic investments that have historically fueled, as we said at the beginning, civil rights movements, immigrant justice work, worker power building, community safety, and also multiracial coalition building. So philanthropy is not, quote, in the crosshairs by accident. It is being targeted because when philanthropy is courageous, when it boldly funds and aligns with movements, it actually expands democratic possibility and it strengthens community power. And it helps to shift the narrative and what what is in the public imagination. It brings new spaces and new voices into the conversation. And that is precisely what anti-democratic actors want to suppress right now. So as we move into our conversation, here's the central question that we're going to be exploring throughout. How can philanthropy remain courageous and justice-oriented in a moment that's designed to divide, to incentivize silence, neutrality, and retreat? So think about that. We're going to discuss what it means for funders to resist this kind of chilling effect and how to anchor in truth when equity language is under attack, when our work is under attack, how philanthropy can play a decisive role in protecting community power and democratic participation, even when doing so carries political risk. I don't think I need to say this, but I'll say it anyway. This is not a conversation about fear. This is a conversation about possibility. The possibility that emerges when philanthropy leans into trust and relationships and lived experience and the long-term infrastructure that's really needed to sustain our movements. It's also about the responsibility that philanthropy holds in moments of political retrenchment, right? Not just to hold the line, but to build forward. So, with that grounding, let's move into our conversation. I'm sorry, I might cough through this. Getting over a cold. And I think many of us are struggling with that right now. Let me not take any more time before introducing our speakers. Excuse me so much. We've got, and they'll start to pop in onto the screen. What I wanted to remind you all is that if you want to be able to see everybody at the same time, there's a function, the view function at the top right corner of the Zoom, where you can select your speaker view. All right, so let me introduce our speakers joining us today. First is Carmen Rojas, who is the president and CEO of the Marguerite Casey Foundation. We have Monica Parisa Rabii, who is the vice president of strategic partnership programs at Neo Philanthropy. We've got Damon Connors, senior program officer for defending inclusive democracy at the Kettering Foundation. Ashley Gardier, who is president of PolicyLink, and Edgar Villanueva, who is the founder and CEO of Decolonizing Wealth Project and Liberated Capital. He's also the author of Decolonizing Wealth. So welcome to all of you. We're going to take 1 second while everybody gets situated. And Eddie, I think you're going to launch a second poll, and we'll just get some quick feedback from everybody joining. The question that's popping up on the screen is, when foundations retreat from explicit equity commitments, the biggest consequence is, and folks are responding now. There are two that are sort of tied right now in first place. One sentiment is reinforcing inequities that philanthropy claims to address. That becomes the consequence. I see underfunding of frontline Black, Indigenous, and people of color-led organizations as the consequence. And there's a bit of each. So thank you for taking a minute to respond. Let's dig into the questions right now, into our conversation. I'm going to start with kind of a round robin. Think of this as maybe more of like an elevator pitch response. So maybe some shorter responses, but give us your sense of things. And so I want to invite Carmen and then Monica and then Damien to help lead us off. And here's what I wanted to pose to you three. And Carmen, hopefully you can kick us off.
Happy to.
But tell us a little bit about, through the lens of your own work in Marguerite Casey, how are you seeing today's backlash against racial justice and gender equity and multiracial democracy? How are you seeing that show up in philanthropy? And why do you feel compelled to respond? And what does an effective and morally grounded and courageous philanthropic response look like to you in this moment?
Yeah. So first, thank you so much for having me here today. For folks who joined early, you got to see me sing a song to Ashley, who I just love so much. And so I'm really grateful to share space with all of you. For us at Marguerite Casey Foundation, a morally grounded response starts with asking two very simple questions. The first one is, who is doing this to us? And the second one is, who are we willing to leave behind? So let's talk about the first question. For us, we've been spending a lot of time over the last year really tracking what we are about to witness nationally, which is the largest transfer of wealth from the poorest people in our country to the richest people amongst us. And so we know who is doing this to us. It's billionaires and corporate leaders that believe that their ability to hoard wealth should supersede the lives and the well-being and the dignity of everyday working people in this country. We respond to this as a foundation by using the full weight of our resources. So that doesn't mean just the 5%. It means using 100% of our resources, our endowment specifically, to actually counteract in that force. And I feel like so much of philanthropy has been left off the hook at the 95%. The majority of our resources subsidize harm while giving pennies to the good that we imagine, that we hope and want for the world. And so for us, we've actively divested from corporations and funds that are peddling in lies. We actively divest from corporations that are pickpocketing us and actually making money off of this administration and political moment. And we are divesting from those corporations and funds that are making money off of detaining, deporting, and imprisoning our people. The second question, who are we willing to leave behind? This has been an animating question for us for a while. And for us, it's absolutely nobody, from our board to our most junior staff. That has been the clarity. And I feel like what has made this moment really easy for us to navigate and move through. We aren't willing to leave behind our Palestinian brothers and sisters who are being killed at this moment at the hands of our government. We aren't willing to leave behind our undocumented brothers and sisters in this moment who are being picked up off the street by masked agents of the state. And we aren't willing to punch the left in order to move to a pretend center or a pluralist future in order to imagine a big tent so that we can come up with middle of the road solutions that actually don't bring people dignity, opportunity, and well-being for all.
There's certain lines that are going to stick out to me the whole time, and divesting from pickpocketers is one of them. Thanks, Carmen. Monica, what do you think about this?
Yeah, thank you. And again, thanks so much for being here and for everyone who's joining in. I think so the first part of the question was like, how are we seeing how are we seeing it manifest today in philanthropy? And I think, first of all, let's be honest, there's a fair bit of what we saw post 2020 that we always knew was performative in terms of any commitments made to racial equity or racial justice. So I think for a lot of us, it wasn't surprising some of the rollback initially, but I think the seeing a lot of the early capitulations and the capitulations in advance under pressure, that is taking the strongest toll on our communities who are on the front lines, and that is showing there was a lack of commitment and signaling that kind of movement. And so for us, the why we need to respond is exactly that. It is to signal that there are many of us who are in this for the long haul. We are doubling down, we are committed, and we're steadfast in that commitment. And in terms of what it looks like for our work and on my team, we're supporting the continued growth of trust-based philanthropy approaches and participatory decision-making and participatory grant-making. And that is something that we are concerned is under attack in this moment because the kind of white supremacists look at urgency and that there's not enough time for doing that work well is also kind of part of what the attack is all about. And so we're afraid of a rollback of work that we've been engaging in over multiple decades to get us to this point of centering folks who have direct lived experience and that there's many ways of learning and knowing. And so for us, the answer is what the answer it's always been. This work has never been easy and the battles are long, but community-led funds are the answer. They always have been. And to be steadfast in that conviction. It's both from the moral ethical imperative of nothing about us without us, right? So how could anyone propose to know the solutions if you are not on the front lines? But it's also from a pragmatic one. We know that the people who are first to leave are those who have the privilege and power to do so. They are farther from the harm. And so the solutions have always been and will continue to be from those who are most affected and the most vulnerable. And their work will continue unabated. And then I think on the day-to-day, something I'm always telling myself, my team and other peers and colleagues that we're in solidarity with is on the day-to-day, it looks like centering your community needs, voices, values over your own anxieties. Always asking yourself that question means a constant check of your own ego, of your institution, of saying, are we doing what we can in this moment to be centering those voices most affected?
Thank you, Monica. All right, Damien, your turn.
Yeah. So first, thank you all for hosting this panel. And for fear of repeating Carmen and Monica, I just want to plus one everything that they've said so far. Um, Through the lens of my work at the Kettering Foundation, uh, what we're seeing with regard to the backlash against racial justice, gender equity, and multiracial democracy building. Um, in the philanthropic context, is what was been named already, which is in part a retreat from naming, from doing the direct naming of race, identity, and structural exclusion, and of course, that's because of fear of kind of the political scrutiny. And then the other is kind of a narrowing of priorities, which in many respects leads to the kind of devaluing of the lived experiences of people in communities, particularly those in communities most impacted by inequities. And across the field, so to speak, we're witnessing kind of softening of commitments, which I think, maybe just a decade ago or a few years ago, there was a lot of clarity and conviction and direct naming of some of the systemic and structural challenges, particularly in these moments of kind of pushback and national uprising against racial injustice. And the movement for Black Lives, and as well as what we saw in Minnesota just after the killing of George Floyd is evidence of that. But we're also seeing kind of tremendous courage on the part of some organizations, namely some represented here in this conversation today. Our president and CEO, Sharon Davies, speaks to what she's calling three C's, which are required for this moment, which is one, clarity, coalition, and courage. And clarity about the stakes of the moment, coalitions as a necessity for doing meaningful future building, and then courage. And I think that's kind of a mandate for philanthropy as well as organizations out there doing the on the groundwork. Um, for me, what concerns me most about the retreat element of the philanthropic space is that it suggests that the work of building a multiracial democracy is too risky, too divisive, and too costly to support. And that's a problem that is a problem over time. And also, it undermines the conditions that are required to advance inclusive democracy, or this notion of a multiracial democracy, because those conditions are rooted in these notions of dignity and inclusion, and a belief that all people should have a share and a hand in shaping kind of our shared and collective future. Um, I don't feel necessarily only feel compelled to do this work because it's my job. And the goal of the focus area that I lead at the Kettering Foundation is to raise awareness and respond to threats to democracy. But I'm compelled to at the personal level, because the stakes are profoundly moral. As a person of faith, I'm committed to these notions of justice and love and what they mean, and how they manifest themselves in our politics and the ways in which we build community and interact with one another. And in our work at the Kettering Foundation is kind of centered on the idea that a healthy democracy requires that communities can name their problems, can determine their own priorities, and take collective action, and that it also requires truth-telling, government accountability, and deep and persistent resistance to authoritarianism, and in the ways in which it manifests to stoke division. I think when philanthropic institutions kind of pull back their support for racial equity or gender justice, we're constraining in some ways the public's capacity to do that work. Because in many ways, the philanthropy is an enabling kind of resource. For fear of speaking too far out of time, another piece of what I think is important now is just the courage to kind of dream forward. A few weeks ago, I was on a work trip in Brazil. And I happened to stumble into a restaurant and they had a whole bunch of quotes on the wall. And one of the quotes read in Portuguese, "Those who dream beautiful dreams fight better." And I think it's the work of philanthropy to fund that dreaming, to be a source of support for those dreams of a brighter and better future that includes everyone.
I'm so glad you told that story. Yeah. Did you say for those who dream beautiful dreams, fight better? Did the
Yes,
word fight?
yes,
Yeah.
fight
Wow.
better.
Amazing. Thank you all. Okay, Ashley and Edgar are like chomping to get in the conversation. So let me pose one to you. And Ashley, maybe you can kick us off. How is political pressure, right? Not just at the federal level, but also in our states and in our communities, shaping the funding landscape and organizational risk and the freedom to support, as everybody has talked about, community-led justice projects. So, through the lens of PolicyLink, why do you feel compelled to respond? And what does an effective and, again, morally grounded and courageous philanthropic response look like in this moment, including how philanthropy can partner with social justice and mission-oriented organizations and really strengthen community power and protect our democratic participation?
Well, first of all, thank you. I just really am honored to be a part of this conversation. This group of leaders is extraordinary. Second, I'm another one of those coughers. I don't know when it will happen, so I just want to warn you, I'm still struggling with the dry cough. To your question, um, I think that this current political moment and pressure really is revealing two truths. The first, as you've heard across the panel, is that this nation, our democracy, our economy, really never were built for everyone's thriving. Just weren't. And so we've really been struggling, from my perspective, from a singular question from the beginning. Are we going to govern for some? Or are we going to govern for all? That's the question. And so far, our history is revealing a hard truth that really, despite all of the beautifully written promises in our founding documents, and I actually do think that they are beautiful promises, I believe in them, those first framers never designed for all. That's the first truth. The second, can sometimes feel a little harder to swallow. First, I want to just acknowledge that while there have been other founding moments across our nation's history, so women's suffrage and the Reconstruction after the Civil War, the Civil Rights Movement, the fight for marriage equality, many of us, just like those first framers, and despite our own definitions and declarations about equity and inclusion, we have also let the principles of scarcity and competition and rugged individualism rule the day as well. The example that I get, I grew up in Baptist church. You can't just tell people about what they're doing. You have to own your own stuff too, right? So my example is a personal one. So at PolicyLink, we define equity as just and fair inclusion into a society in which all people participate, prosper, and reach their full potential. That's our definition of equity. And you hear that word again, all. It's in the equity definition and the founding documents. And yet, in the transition from our founder, the first generation leadership, to the second generation leadership of PolicyLink, our staff asked the question, like, okay, so does this mean we can just focus on Black and Brown people now? It's a fair question, right? We're a policy organization. The data keeps showing us the same people keep getting left out every time. Can we just focus on Black and Brown folks? Our answer was no, because the promise of the founding documents and the equity definition is all. It's all. But the second truth is that it turns out that some of us didn't mean all either. And so that unspoken truth has been revealing itself more and more, like with every year over these past few years, this truth that we have lost the ability to see each other, to care for one another. I wanted to take us out of the politics for a second. Just this year, remember January 25 feels like 7 lifetimes ago, but we started with a terrorist attack here in New Orleans and a bombing in Las Vegas. And then immediately following the wildfires in Los Angeles, we witnessed the same, like that standard refrain of us versus them. Like, who do we really care about? Who are we really going to take care of? Um, and so I would just submit that this current moment of real destruction and despair and dismantling is just the next test, and a necessary test, of whether we will once and for all commit to realizing the promise of all in our founding documents and our equity definition. And so, to your question, PolicyLink has accepted that work, realizing this promise of all as the most effective, morally grounded, courageous response for social justice and mission oriented organizations, and for philanthropy too. And ironically, because it feels like these days we're competing about who's the most patriotic, and we're always declared as the people who are not, I actually believe that it turns out to be the most patriotic thing that we could do, actually work in service of all.
Okay, Edgar, jump in.
All right. Hi, everyone. Really great comments. Excited to be here. For me, I just was thinking I want to ground myself in what's really happening here. And we know the catastrophic effects that we've seen on the nonprofit sector around funding because of government disruptions, but also the way that philanthropy has been behaving in this moment. I really appreciate the comments that are zooming us out, right? I think philanthropy is often a microcosm of what's really happening more broadly in our communities. And so I do think that what from my perspective and the work that we do at DWP, which is so deeply rooted and grounded in healing and sort of spiritual transformation as a pathway towards collective care, is that I see a major heart problem in this country, and I see a major spiritual problem that is at the root of a lot of the things that are happening here. We see the weaponization of faith, this white Christian nationalist movement that has so aligned themselves with policies and practices that are just anti-human, right? And definitely anti-justice, and are contributing to the erosion of our democracy and our rights. And so I feel super compelled to respond to this issue for all kinds of reasons. One, personally impacted by all of this. And the work at DWP for the last 7 years, we have made tremendous headway within the philanthropic sector and beyond to create a framework around repair to unlock $1 billion of resources toward repair in Black and Indigenous communities in America. And with all of that progress, to me, this is a part of the backlash, because we've seen progress in the last 50 years in movement. We've seen this progress in the last decade within philanthropy, and so it's all an attack on us for for the progress. I still believe in the promise of philanthropy. I think that we're just at a crossroads, that our house of justice is on fire and philanthropy holds a fire hose, and we have a role to play and could play in helping to put out that fire depending on our behavior. The challenge that we see in this moment is something that we've been saying for years at DWP, is that when philanthropy is built on colonial extraction, that philanthropy will always be vulnerable to colonial retraction. And so the scrambling that we see of organizations scrubbing their websites, rebranding equity as opportunity, going dark in general, all of these things are really a predictable result of when relationships between funders and movements have been transactional. And so we really see who is really about that life, or who is with us in these times, where we really need folks. And I think what we're seeing is really that, especially, I'll speak to progressive funders, and many of them have gone dark. Like, where are they? Where's the long-term commitment? Where's the real vision for solidarity? It was easy, I think, in the early 2000s to or after the murder of George Floyd, which was 2020s, I should say, to be next to us and to be in solidarity and be connected. But now that the pain is really expanded and is pinching everyone, a lot of folks have disappeared. And so I think that this is a moment for courageous leadership and response. We're seeing some of that happen. We need more of it to happen. We need to stop the language games. We need to call things what they are. We need to just, stop being so afraid and willfully obeying and bowing down before there's even a law or something that's requiring us to do that. Private philanthropy must be really explicit about stepping up, giving the freedoms that private funders have, that many nonprofits don't face, actually, and they also may have the resources to fight, and to organize in ways that others may not. So there are a couple of funders that we can name a point to who are really doing that are inspirational. And But all of this, I think, is getting at thinking about just our relationship with each other and what we need and what we must have in place to save our democracy, to protect our way of life, and to be in right relationship. Philanthropy has never been in right relationship with communities. We've made some progress again in the last few months, but these moments are really showing us, our true colors and who really is about that life again. And so that's my pitch is like, what are we going to do to really put skin in the game, like it really matters. I've been in meetings where we talk about what's happening in communities. We're living under a dictatorship, democracy is eroding. But then when it gets to the conversation about money and strategy, it's like a different conversation. We're not willing to bring that same urgency and that same realistic sort of worldview around what's happening to how we're moving money. So this starts to actually move money in a real way, to move a lot more of it. At DWP, we have our Moonshot 10-year strategy, which is to unlock $1 trillion toward repair. And we're finding that as a really timely organizing call and campaign for folks to get behind in this moment. And it's just what is required of us to prove that our talk isn't just talk, but we really want to put, as I said, skin in the game to really save this democracy. I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you so much. So I hope you all, I don't know if you're watching both things, right? Watching each other, but also watching the chat, because the call and response thing that I called out at the beginning. First, we've seen a ton of friends including some folks who joined us for Equity Matters a couple of months ago. Shout out Dr. Harris, who I saw pop up in the chat, but it's just alive, right? You have a lot of folks who really resonate, including with some of the provocations that you all are offering, and just a lot of what you shared, and I'm sort of highlighting them in my own notes, are going to become, I know, the threads and themes that we keep running through this conversation. So thank you all for the opening, and we've got some questions already coming in, so we're going to turn to those in a second. But just want to thank you all for setting the stage here. Damien, I'm gonna pose a question to you, because a lot of what you each did was you went back in time and then forward in time and really are drawing the connections between the two. So I know your work particularly, and your background are about bridging democracy and public deliberation and civil rights legacy organizations like the SCL, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and really addressing racial disparities and injustice and their intersections. And we've been thinking a lot, including with some conversation with the Eisenhower Foundation, about the Kerner Commission that warned back in 1968 that the United States was really moving toward two societies, one Black, one white, separate and unequal. So in your view, how has philanthropy advanced or neglected to advance the Commission's call to address structural racism, and what responsibilities do funders have now, especially amid these new forms of segregation and political authoritarianism?
Thanks for the question, Wendy. One of the things that I know during my time at the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, particularly in leadership there as executive director, I was able to interact with a lot of the luminaries from the civil rights movement. And what I learned through that experience was that organizations like SCLC that were really rooted in this idea that America could live into its promise, and similar to what Ashley raised earlier in her comments. But the organization also, in many ways, shaped our modern understanding of justice. And so I learned in that context that, democracy is not just some abstract governance only ideal, but a lived practice that's rooted in people's capacity to kind of come together, to reason together, and to act together. And particularly to challenge and shift kind of static mindsets and institutional practices that place limitations on belonging and who belongs. I think I believe when the Kerner Commission concluded in 1968 that the nation was moving toward two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. It was issuing a warning, but it was also naming and affirming kind of the long-standing contradiction and crisis of democracy in the United States. And I argued the Americas broadly, as we kind of think about, the realities of colonialism and the vestiges of slavery. And to push what was asserted by the commission, I offer that the commission was also naming kind of a post-colonial global crisis of anti-Black racism. So beyond this frame of like a Black society, white society, but actually naming that anti-Black racism kind of is a real thing. And I think philanthropy has and still has kind of a critical role in shaping how the nation and the globalized world responds to that crisis of anti-Black racism. I think over the past few decades, philanthropy has played a meaningful role in resourcing civil rights organizations and supporting community-based leadership, and elevating racial equity frameworks that I think have helped many institutions begin to see the structural dimensions of racism as systemic and not just kind of interpersonal. And those investments, in some respects, gave communities the tools to challenge discriminatory policies and to develop new civic infrastructures capable of broadening participation. But we see with the simple attacks on DEI and other race conscious policies, how quickly those ideas and ideals can be rolled back. I also think that philanthropy has fallen short in many ways, in that, excuse me, that some of the funding strategies of foundations and philanthropic groups focused on short cycles. They focused on glitzy and glamorous projects that had little to no impact, but gave visibility you know uh, to the funding strategy of said organization or foundation. Um, and I think too often treated racial inequity as kind of a technical issue that can be fixed through programs rather than the kind of a structural feature of American political and economic life, which I think Ashley mentioned earlier as well. Um, and I think too often the sector too has asked communities to innovate while withholding long-term power building resources, the kinds of resources that are required to transform systems, and miss that opportunity too often. Um, so, I think the Kerner Commission report was right. Uh, in many respects, and philanthropy has done work, but also has missed a lot of opportunities. And in this moment, can really step up to the plate to begin to answer some of those questions around the structural kind of dimensions of racial inequity in the United States specifically, and the impacts on political and economic life. So, in thinking about like what funders can do now, I think there's an opportunity to invest in the democratic capacities of the people most affected by inequity. And that means and could look like supporting community-rooted organizations, sustain civic learning, and spaces where people um, in places across the country can both organize and deliberate across difference. I think democracy survives when people have the skills and infrastructure to exercise agency together. At the Kettering Foundation, we have a group of research fellows, and one of those fellows is Professor Diva Woodley, uh, and what she describes recognizes kind of what I mentioned, and she says that people on the ground making social change are social and political theorists in their own right, and their theories of change are both emergent and explicit in their actions, institutions, and discourses. And I think that's so true. There has to be a deep recognition of the capacities, ideas, visions that exist on the ground and at the ground level. So I think it's important for funders to be in touch with what's happening on the ground and resist the kind of paternalistic positional urge to kind of overassert or oversuppose, but rather get more curious about what's happening in places across the country. Um, a second opportunity, I think, is to support long kind of horizon structural change, which I think communities need more grants. Kettering is not a grant-making foundation, but we partner with organizations that are doing really great, meaningful work that need additional support. I think philanthropy must be committed to kind of that long-term funding that helps strengthen community infrastructure and institutions. And then third and lastly, I think we have to defend inclusive democracy proactively. I think funders have a responsibility to challenge efforts that restrict participation, that silence marginalized voices, or concentrate power. And I think we have to get really vocal and really bold. And again, I just want to kind of go back to those three C's that Sharon Davies, who's the president and CEO of Kettering Foundation, often raised, which is that we have to have clarity about the stakes of the moment, really be clear about the power of coalition, and then have the courage to do the work and to speak out in this moment. But those are just some of my thoughts around the possibilities at the moment. And lastly, I'll say that part of the work of defending inclusive democracy, this focus area that I lead at the Kettering Foundation, begins with a particular truth, which is that there is no multiracial inclusive democracy without racial justice, which is why I wanted to underscore what I suppose the current Kerner Commission report to be saying is that anti-Black racism is a real experienced reality for many across the country.
There's so much in what, what you just said, what each of you are sharing. It's hard to like pick out and respond to one thing. I saw a lot of attention to a lot of things that you said and was thinking one of the last comments I saw was to your point about philanthropy funds in these short cycles, right? And the paternalism embedded in that. And, I got into a conversation. I have also been in and out of philanthropy. And so understood the story, but recognize that I was talking to somebody the other day, and we were talking about Project 2025. And I said, yeah, but that was like a 40 plus year in the making investment strategy, right? By philanthropy, not your philanthropies. That's the kind of time horizon it takes to make some of the shifts that you're talking about. And it was, it was just an understanding that they had never heard before, didn't realize. So thank you so much. Eddie, you're going to help me put up the next poll, and we'll just take a minute to get a little feedback where the question is, the most significant barrier to shifting power in philanthropy is, and then Edgar, I'm going to come to you for a question next. Let's see what the poll shows us. So we're seeing a pretty good mix actually across each of the four responses. One, that wealth accumulation is built on historical inequities. A couple of you have really talked about that. That concentration of decision-making power is predominantly with white boards. The belief that community governance models are too radical. There's been a number of you have sort of spoken to that. And just, the sort of dominant risk-averse culture that favors that, what Monica, you said in the beginning about white dominant culture, right? Risk-averse, urgency. I can't see the last one. There are more responses. Sorry. Let me scroll down a little bit. Oh, narratives that frame racial justice giving as politically dangerous. Yeah. Lots. The most responses are all of the above. Thank you all for chiming in. Edgar, I'm going to come over to you. So you talked about this, you've written about it, but your work really has called out the colonial roots of philanthropy and the ways that its wealth both originates from land theft and exploitation, extraction, racialized harm, and codified this understanding of the racial justice funding gap that shows that Black, Indigenous, people of color-led organizations remain still today dramatically underfunded. And so how did today's political tax on diversity, equity, inclusion, on community power, on racial justice actually deepen the urgency to decolonize philanthropic decision-making and things like redistribution, governance, narrative shift? How do funders actually start to confront that ethical contradiction of using wealth that's been accumulated through historically extractionist means to actually advance equity?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think that it gets at the heart of the contradiction that philanthropy has always tried to avoid naming. I remember back, I was speaking to a group of young grant makers at a conference, who were, coming from community, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, ready to make a change. And when I basically told them the reality of like, you work for off of corporate money, like all philanthropy is like corporate money, basically, that was made by some business or corporation somewhere and is attached to capitalism. Just the reality check and the sadness that kind of came over that group. But I'm like, it is what it is. These are, we for so long have kind of paraded around philanthropy as if we were detached and pure, and the good guys and everyone else were the bad guys. And so I think that, what it really takes to get into a right relationship with community and to think about using these resources in spite of all the contradictions is to really think about just truth and reconciliation. Our reparative philanthropy model at DWP has supported donors, has supported foundations, and kind of walking through that and like just being honest, like asking, where did this money come from? Who was hurt in the process of this wealth accumulation, and what responsibilities do organizations have or families have to kind of right those wrongs? And a lot of us in the community already know these histories, but when foundations kind of show up with a savior complex and are not willing to kind of confront some of the things that we already know in community, it's not going to lend itself to a great relationship. And so, it's all complicated, and we have to kind of put aside either or thinking and just kind of hold those contradictions that, yeah, philanthropy is a byproduct of a racial capitalized system. And at the same time, philanthropy has played a role throughout history in supporting in the civil rights movement. And like money is a thing, and it's really not about the money, which is what we teach at DWP. Money has a history and an energy attached to it, but we can, kind of move that, flip that on its paradigm, or use money in a good way. So it's really about us, like human beings and organizations, that, and how we decide to use money. And as money has been a tool to harm, it can be a tool to heal. And so, what we're seeing, now, and why this is so important is that, organizations that have been chronically underfunded already, who may have received some attention and a bump after the murder of George Floyd, and, all of the, so-called solidarity that we were seeing when everyone put the black squares on Instagram, even with that bump, like our organizations led by Indigenous folks, Black folks, people of color, remain chronically underfunded. And so, The urgency is really real in communities, and but I want to sort of push back on a framing that this moment is uniquely urgent. For communities that have experienced 400 or 500 years of extraction, land theft, stolen land, this is not this urgency has always sort of been the condition. And so, what's changed is that some funders got comfortable with talking about equity a little bit there. And now, when things are a little uncomfortable, they may want to retreat. And so, we just really need to get to a place of true solidarity and just honesty about where wealth came from and how it has harmed, but also how it can be a tool. There's so much that exists these days, has been mentioned already on this call, in terms of infrastructure that has been built around philanthropy, and to support donors who are on these journeys, from helping you with the emotional, spiritual work to kind of come to terms with with that harm, and helping you, transform wealth into medicine through infrastructure that has been built in communities to move money. So you can shift that power. You don't have to decide, because we have community-led funds all around who are ready to deploy capital, who have trust and relationships with those communities. And so there's really no excuse at this point in time for funders to not do the work, to get into a real right relationship that is centered around trust, and also to move money through mechanisms that already exist. And so it may be the case that big philanthropy can never get there, in terms of, that trust, because it's been, so much has happened. But what philanthropy can do is plug and play through these, beautiful ecosystems of funds that exist to help support getting resources throughout our communities, that are both sort of moving money and moving land. And so the last thing I'll say is that, I think that, um, the truth here is that we don't resolve this contradiction. It is something that we just have to hold, and we don't get to feel clean about it, and we don't get to actually blame it on the money. We have to blame it on ourselves and take that personal responsibility to right these wrongs and to get into right relationship. And so that means, either if you're a wealth holder, you do your personal work, you do your work with your family to ask the question, where did this wealth come from? What responsibility do I have to its history to right those wrongs? It also means, as institutions, that we also take up that responsibility to say, well, hey, for many years we have not invested in communities of color. We have not supported leaders of color. We have not supported, general operating support that allows for movement building to really flourish. Own that, and then begin to think about what we can do to transform that, and just pushing back on this narrative, this thing that exists of us versus them, funder versus recipient, and to really understand we're just really all in this together, and that, we're not begging for money for poor Black and brown people. We're extending a lifeline into your liberation, freedom, and to saving your democracy. And Because we're really in this thing together. And so we're about transforming wealth into collective well-being, because when we center those communities and give them the power and self-determination to use resources, those communities who have experience, who have been here before, they're not only fighting for their communities, but they're fighting for all of us. And so it's just so important now that we adequately resource and move money, to those folks. So I'll pause there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Okay, we've everybody folks are starting to chat in questions, which is really good. I'm going to shift up our flow a little bit. Ashley, I'm going to ask you a question, and then we're going to pause, get to some of the Q&A, and then Carmen and Monica coming back around to you. Okay, Ashley, PolicyWorks work explicitly connects racial equity, the redesign of national systems like governance and economy and democracy. And historically, funders have played roles in supporting multiracial coalitions, the Poor People's Campaign, for example. Currently, many foundations are sort of continue to center risk management over justice, which leads to risk-averse giving and sometimes burdensome reporting, competition. Somebody mentioned competition earlier, and that sort of scarcity mode when you're deciding between organizations that have similar missions and are all doing good work. What are the kind of structural shifts in philanthropy whether it's governance or narrative or accountability, are going to be necessary if funders really want to change systems and not merely do programs.
Mm-hmm. I'm trying not to get distracted by something I heard in your read of the question this time around risk management, but I'm distracted. One thing that folks can do is help our institutions make sure that our operational shops can withstand the level of scrutiny that is coming. That was not a part of my original, but that's the whole thing. Like how they come for us is in our books. How they come for us is like the credit card reimbursement, the do you have clean audits? Have you submitted audits? So that is not the question that you asked, but that is something that for the people who are most risk averse, you can just focus on that, like just making sure that folks' shops can withstand the scrutiny. When PolicyLink talks about redesigning the nature and logic of governing institutions so that they serve all, um, we understand that that's nation building work. And we really do think that this is kind of a from the ashes nation building moment. But if we think differently about this moment and really see it as a nation building moment, as a next founding moment, then it actually lets us be more expansive in the range of roles that folks can play across the sector and in philanthropy. Nation building moments mean like you need all the roles, all of them, except for if you're like trying to advance authoritarianism, right? Don't need that one. But we need defenders. So folks like the Lawyers Committee and the Legal Defense Fund and Democracy Forward, who are literally defending the fundamentals of our democracy in court. You need organizers. I'm in Louisiana, so I'm always using local examples to Damien's point about like on the ground, the Power Coalition, Housing Louisiana, those folks who are still winning policies like at the ballot box in local communities and are defeating these like statewide efforts by our governors to remove power, to diminish our authority and our resources as we the people. You need storytellers and culture bearers and messengers that really are doing the work of shifting hearts and minds of everyday people, really moving us from this winners and losers construct, that framework that we've been trapped in for all the years, to an all consciousness, really believing that you can win and I can win at the same time, right? And you need dreamers and builders, folks like PolicyLink that really are laser focused on creating a United States that finally works for everyone. That requires new legal theories, because you asked about some of the structural stuff, right? New legal theories. Model policies and regulations, that's always been a part of our work, but we're now talking about a different scale of intervention than we've ever delivered before. New kinds of partnerships that do not require us to lift off of our core values, but that start to like force the question about core values across just our friends and family networks. This moment is a calling the question moment. But given the range of roles, and that's just a couple, right? It also allows funders to choose how they're going to manifest their courage and power. Like part of your question was like, come on, y'all, get back in it. Where's your power and courage? I feel like if we look at the full range of the roles that need to get played, then you give funders choice because they have it, whether we like it or not. Funders do get to choose how they spend their money. The baddest and boldest, funders, some of which are on this call, right? They might actually lean into like the powerful defense work and the organizing work. Some of the others may say, well, sign me up for the storytelling and the building work, right? And as you might imagine, some of those investments are visible and some are not necessarily so. Everything we can't see it all in this moment. One of the other things I love about your question is this reference to systems change. And I know I'm biased. I keep telling y'all PolicyLink has chosen. We are on the nation building side of things, the future focused side. But I know that 100% of the nonprofits that are on this call have had to respond to a question in a grant proposal or a report that's like, well, how does your strategy contribute to systems or structural change, right? Like we've all had to respond to that. I think redesigning the nature and logic of our governing institutions, right? Like actually going back to the beginning and being clear about codifying the new set of values that really demand that we deliver for everybody. Really building out these new legal theories that realize the affirmative. Let me back up. There's a promise in our Constitution in the 14th Amendment. It actually says that our government has an affirmative duty to deliver for all its people. That's in the 14th Amendment. Because we don't realize that, we keep being tricked. Somebody asked a question in the chat about power. We keep getting tricked into like the box that's been set for us. We think the only rights we have are like they're only activated when we're discriminated against, right? Like I have a right to housing, but I only get to feel that right once you've discriminated against me. And by the way, I have to prove to you that you discriminated against me and like all of that. The 14th Amendment promises an affirmative duty of government to deliver for all of us. Structural change, system change is how do we translate that affirmative duty into durable and permanently enforceable laws, right? Structural change in this moment, none of us would have signed up for dismantling federal agencies. Like we wouldn't have, even though we knew they weren't serving us the way they could, we would have, our hearts were just like, well, at least it's serving somebody and I don't want to take away the resources, all of that. Now all of that's gone. So structural change, reimagining HUD and EPA and the Department of Transportation and the Department of Justice. It won't be in New Orleans. We say, ain't there no more, right? Like it won't be there anymore. That feels like systems change to me. And so I think the real question is, will philanthropy accept its own invitation to structural change and ultimately an invitation to be a co-founder of this nation?
Yeah. Oh my goodness. Okay. I gotta, where do I want to start? You have offered now a couple of times this provocation about all. So playing off of what you just said, which was one way to answer part of the questions that's been raised in the chat. So Ashley, for you, and I want to ask, sorry, I know there's so much to share, but if you can do like a 1 minute response, and then I have a few other questions for folks. Go back and talk through how does all translate when there's one group that already has access and resources? So it's a different answer than I think the one you just provided, which was also very provocative.
Yeah, one is that now when we hear all, the first thing we go to is like, oh, okay, got it. So instead of Black Lives Matter, all lives matter. So we back to the whitewashing. Like, I'm not doing that. I want to be clear when we talk about all, we are actually meaning all, and particularly so. Remember, we are a policy and data shop. So when we say all, we intend to use our data to say, and guess what? In New Orleans, Black men every time, not in the all. That's why we have to lean in right there. Or when we're in a different part of the country, it's like every time, Hmong population, every time. That's why we're leaning in right there. And so it's not a whitewashing. It is about leaning in, particularly calling the question every time when the data shows us who's being shut out. Poor white people in this community, every time, that's who loses, right? That we get to lean into that, to demand the fullness of all. That's one piece. Now to the power question. I don't have a lot of time, so I'm gonna do the quick, insufficient one. I used to work for a bank. Long time ago, I worked for a bank, and it was one of the big banks. And it struck me when I worked there, you mean 5 banks control the economy of this country? There are 5 banks. That means 5 white men who just are making all the decisions for everyone, except there's 330 million of us. I refuse to give up my power. That's part of why we're coming back to this all. The all is a full activation of everyone. You don't get to just I'm the CEO of the bank, and so I run the country. And so one of the things that we're pushing on is like, we don't have to give up our power, but I'll just leave it there. Don't give up the power. We have it. That's what all this solidarity we keep talking about is
Yeah.
about, so that we can actually decide who these United States is for. And we say it's for all of us.
This is so amazing. For anybody who's worried, like, have I grabbed all the nuggets? Like, what? I'm still thinking about the thing, I am also still thinking about the things you all said in the first round. There is a way in which we both offer the recording for this, so you'll have it, everybody, but also try to document, right, some of these really incredible things that all of you are sharing. So rest assured that's coming back. Edgar, I want to go back to you, and then Carmen, I have a question for you, and then I'm actually going to pose another question to you after that. So part of your work has actually shaped a foundation that I was serving on the board for. It's called IF, the IF Foundation, and really thinking about that burden, that tension that we always have to hold in philanthropy of where did this money come from, and how can we actively work into right relationship with community from whom we've extracted. So this question came up, has anyone actually doing 10-year minimum grants? Given conservative funders have this pattern of funding these long-term projects across decades, how are progressive funders making truly long-term commitments? Any thoughts?
I have heard, I think maybe of one or two foundations who are doing 10-year grants. It's very rare. I've been in this industry for 20 plus years now, and I have to say that so many of the things where we have data and evidence in terms of what works in moving money, general operating support, long term, all those kinds of things, for whatever reason, it seems so hard to get there for this sector. And what this aha moment sort of that I had with myself earlier this year is like so much of the evangelizing that I do around shifting to those best practices. I'm actually talking to progressive funders. Like, conservative funders got to figure it out. And so, if you're on the call and you consider yourself a funder and progressive, I'm talking to you right now, because I think we can become self-righteous in our ideology. Sometimes I think, oh, we're doing it right, we're funding grassroots. But when you look at the data, well, first, let me say this. We have an effective philanthropy, an effective example of philanthropy in this country, and that is Donald Trump. That is Project 2025. That all of that, the reason these folks are in power, the reason this plan is in place that is unraveling our nation is it's been fueled and funded by philanthropy, and not philanthropy that was moved in like an urgent crisis situation, but a long play, right? And so part of me is like, when will we learn? When will we learn on the progressive side what it takes to win when there is a clear blueprint that has been laid out for us to do that? And as long as we keep sort of like shifting our language around, staying siloed around our issue areas in terms of how we fund, holding on to the power, not funding leadership development and just getting behind and supporting leaders, requiring nonprofits and movements to be performative and all of those things, we will just never get there. And so I don't know what it is within us. Like, I think I kind of go back to what I said at the top of the call. I think it's a spiritual problem. We have the right ideology, our politics are right, but there's something within our hearts and spirits that are not allowing us to let go of control and to move this money to community where there is expertise and vision to have those long-term strategies. And so, my friend Vanessa Daniel once said that, white supremacy, the cornerstone of white supremacy is control. And those of us who are enlightened and we don't think of ourselves as being racist or whatever, if we're still holding on to control in any kind of way when it comes to these resources, that is a form of white supremacy that is being operationalized within philanthropy. And so we need to build from a new cornerstone that is about deploying these resources in a way. We need to give more. We are outgiven. Progressive donors, individuals give less than conservative donors. Why is that the case, right? I know a couple of reasons that I could throw out there, but we need to give like we've never given before. We need to fund movements like our lives depend on it. And when I say all, Ashley, to the framing that you've offered, this is really a framework that we've worked from day one. We center Black and Indigenous experiences and beliefs in our work, but we are also, we believe in all my relations, which is a core approach in our work, that we're all in this thing together. And I don't think that progressive funders are giving and moving money as much as they should, or in ways they should, because they actually are not truly in solidarity. They don't think that their lives or the future of their kids really depend on it. And so they're giving from a place because it makes sense and it's a good thing to do. But we're at a very different place now where we've got to do something dramatically different. And we have to accept the fact that we've been, outsmarted, outfunded, strategized, and take a page from 2025, and like, where is our progressive blueprint for that, and where is the unlocking of vast resources that are going to go to fund all of those defenders and dreamers and policymakers and folks to assume their role in this bigger place. So philanthropy has an opportunity right now, but we have to put aside what makes us feel good and our foundation getting credit for this thing. We call it this and you call it that, and just like really make it simple. And that is move a shit ton of money to community right now, to the folks who know how to save this democracy, because time is of essence here. And I appreciate long-term views that foundations have around a vision for this, that, and the third. But when you're moving just small dollars for 2 and 3 years toward a 50-year vision, you're not going to get us there. And so that's the uncomfortable truth today, is that we all who show up and see each other at conferences, we're buddies, we
Mm.
high five, our hearts are in the right places. What are we doing? What's still underneath the surface of this industry that is not allowing us to liberate ourselves and to liberate these resources
Mm.
to community in a way that's going to be really impactful?
Yeah. Um, Thank you for animating the issue of control at the center of that. And someone just put in, it's called white supremacy. Um, Carmen, okay, Carmen and Monica, I want to get your voices back in. The question that I was going to pose to you, but I want to see if we can fold it into the next question I sort of wanted to pose to you, Carmen, is really about your aha moments, right? You're both on the kind of leading edge of this. The practice of trust-based philanthropy, the courageous, bold, different kind of grant making and approach to your philanthropies. So think about, I'm gonna go back and ask you a bigger question, Carmen, that we had sort of prepared, but if you can also think about what aha moment, like how are you adjusting your practice real time potentially because of what you're seeing? So I'll leave you with that challenge, but here's what I was gonna ask you. Um, so I'm having a hard time thinking of other foundations that have been as explicit as Marguerite Casey has been in naming and building power. You're resourcing freedom scholars. You're, sustaining justice movements during all of this political hostility. And there are other, Ford Foundation, Field Foundation, Taconic Foundation. These are some of the names that come up when you think about who has, historically funded core civil rights efforts when government itself was resisting integration and discrimination in voting rights. We talked a little bit earlier. I posed the question to Damien at the Kettering Foundation about how, Eisenhower Foundation worked to advance racial and economic justice amid this resistance to equity and multiracial democracy. So given this history and the present chilling effect on racial and economic justice funding, how are you seeing today's perpetual backlash echoing these past eras like Jim Crow, post-civil rights retrenchment, and really how are foundations like Marguerite Casey pushing the field from performative commitments to transformative structural change, and particularly when backlash is constantly incentivizing silence and retreat?
So many questions, so little time. I will start with the aha moments, because I feel like this is probably the place where I most differ from folks on this call and from my peers in philanthropy is that I do think philanthropy is inherently transactional, that at our best, we move the most money with the least amount of friction to our grant recipients. And we as an organization over-index on operational expertise. I want us to be the number one movers of money. So folks have asked about like, how do you move money? How much money? So for us, we offer our grant recipients 25% of their budget for 5 years, and we front load that and give them 70% of that money in the first year, and our staff raises money for them in the subsequent 3 years. When the grant runs out, there's a 2-year grant period in which they cannot reapply, but they can nominate the next round of grant recipients that we get. So we're super clear and transactional. I don't think that our grant recipients should have to give me a high five at a conference or be my friend. And I think that there's a very real difference between nonprofits, organizations, and all sort of an aha moment that I had, especially after taking this job, is that philanthropy has built up a bunch of like ancillary systems to move money when we pay staff very well to move money. And if they can't move money and they can't move it well, then they shouldn't have these jobs. I feel very clear about that. And the gift for me of moving from raising money to giving away money, leading a foundation, was understanding how much time was wasted, both in trying to convince people that my ideas and my work or my leadership or the work that I was doing mattered, like the mining of the genius that happens of nonprofit leaders, the wasting of time that happens, that you have a greater incentive to spend time with philanthropy than to spend time in community. And I feel like we need to have greater sectoral discipline in making the distinction between philanthropy, nonprofits, and people in community. And so this is where I think Ashley's point about the all is really important. 70% of Americans for the last decade have been living paycheck to paycheck. That means on day 13 of your paycheck, you don't know if that you don't get the right amount of money, you may not be able to pay for rent. There is no extra money. 70% of the people who live in this country live that way. The no minimum wage worker in this country can afford a two-bedroom apartment. That like that has not been a right now problem. That is a decades long problem that we have been confronting. And if we don't sort of shift our orientation, I feel like we will continue down this autocratic slide. The third thing is, from our freedom scholars, one of the things that comes up quite a lot is this notion of identity politics. And Barbara Smith from the Combahee River Collective often says, we have stuck to the identity and forgotten the politics. And so a lot of people throw around, this is the identity that we have, but not grounded in whatever politics. And so we find it then difficult to hold leaders of color who are doing things that are bad to our people accountable. We don't know how to have complex conversations about race and power in this country. And I feel like that is sort of a third to fifth aha moment that I've had. You know, this thing around philanthropic practice for me feels super important. And I just love that Ashley mentioned Power Coalition, right? So like we also have a clear barrier. The majority of our grant making, so this means 75% of our grant making goes to organizations with budgets under $5 million. That includes organizations like Power Coalition. This year alone, in Louisiana, in the South, they were able to defeat some of the worst constitutional reforms in the state's history. Things that would have let young people stay in prison forever. Things that would have actually gerrymandered the state and sort of restricted the ability of people to vote and participate in our democracy. People are winning. Grassroots organizations in this country are winning. Turk in Tennessee kept public education available to undocumented people in Tennessee this spring. So we keep having this reflection about what philanthropy could or should be doing. I'm not really so worried about that. Like it's just not my, not my ministry. I feel like people, every foundation is a foundation. What they're doing is what they're doing. I feel like if people want philanthropy to behave differently, stop taking money and organize against them. Do what we ask people in community to do. And nobody really wants to do that. Instead, I think we build ancillary institutions to sort of say, here is an easier way for you to give money, not to community, but through it feels like we have built more vehicles to give away money than we actually do give money to community. Like just in seventh aha in this sort of slam poetry response that I have for you, Wendy. I'd say just like lastly, is this clarity around political commitments feels super, super important. The thing that has felt most disheartening to me, has not been sort of people taking things down off their website. We have received threats since I started to my home. Like people are doing things because it's rationally a fucking scary time. The thing that has been disappointing to me is this weird belief that we need to move to this ever shifting target of centrism and punch it down the left. That we can't actually imagine that we can have a clear critique of capitalism, that we can't imagine that racial justice is a precondition for a multiracial democracy, that we can't imagine a universe in which everyday people who teach in our classrooms, pick up our garbage, take care of our kids, everyday people can live a life of dignity somehow has become sort of this wacky call. And I feel like we saw this the most around the murder of Charlie Kirk, right? When we saw so many people trying to justify sort of their feelings about a white nationalist, and we couldn't just say this was a white nationalist who had a set of beliefs and he should not have been killed. We don't have sort of sectoral discipline and language around a set of politics that are truly inclusive and transformative. And until we do, I think that we will continue to lose. And so I hope that answered the sort of range of questions that you offered, Wendy, and if not, happy to clarify.
Lots of people are just typing in 100, 100, 100%. I mean, offering seven ahas is amazing. Clear and compelling vision. I got to stop looking at the chat or I get distracted, but that's amazing. And I actually didn't know. I didn't know that about Marguerite Casey. And what you shifted that the majority of your grant making is really directed to orgs that are right on the quote unquote smaller end and under 5 million. That was,
I'll just say this, like,
yeah.
I feel like one of the weird things about philanthropy when I started, we had like 250 grant recipients, and it didn't matter if your budget was $20 million or $1 million. You got $100,000. And that just felt stupid. Like it just felt like bad math. We are not the largest foundation in the country, so we should not be funding organizations with 20 million, $10 million budgets. It's unsustainable. So that was the one thing. The second thing is like, what does it mean to have a meaningful commitment to an organization? And before I had this job, I was really lucky. SEIU gave me, at one shot, $5 million. I was the only staff person to build an organization. And then for the next 4 years, they were 25% of my budget. And that meant I didn't have to think about operating expenses. I didn't have to think about meeting space. I mean, like the core of our resources could actually, that I had to raise elsewhere was the imagination work, was to Damien's point, the dreaming money, right? Like I could actually spend my time raising money that created the space and room for me to actually dream and be in relationship with people, to offer meaningful interventions. And so that's why we changed our practice.
Yeah. To fight better. I like it. Okay, Monica, we've waited too long. Let me get to you. Your leadership at Neo Philanthropy is absolutely focused on trust-based and participatory and community-led, community-governed resourcing models that mirror a lot of successful historical examples. I mean, the Highlander Center's movement resourcing, solidarity, philanthropy, and the farm worker movement. So in a period where funders are pressured to retreat and, surveillance of nonprofits is intensifying, how can community-led funds really work to counter the chilling political effects and model new infrastructures of safety? Partnership is what a lot of you have mentioned, right? New partnerships, solidarity, different narrative power.
Absolutely. Thank you. Well, just to start off by saying the terminology trust-based philanthropy, participatory decision-making, participatory grant-making, these are all the myriad ways that we create sector jargon, but we know that these are common sense approaches to work that our communities have been doing for ages, to Edgar's point earlier on. And there's plenty of places that do this incredibly well, and there's tons of opportunity to plug and play into those kinds of approaches. And then I think, obviously the reason why it works is I mentioned it earlier it's the easiest way also to make sure that what you're doing is always useful. You are directly centering as close as possible a voice directly from the community that's most affected. Keeps you accountable, because when you work with community will keep you accountable, and that's also why people shy away from it. And then also I heard Ashley earlier, I loved it, he said, well, to the grant question about systems change, will philanthropy answer its own invitation for structural change? So to me, and this is also something I heard from Damien about democracy, is a lived practice. That's something we say all the time on my team. Process is the point. So I invite a lot of folks to say, if you are focused on defending democracy, are you also practicing that approach in your own work on a day-to-day basis? Are you using any kind of democratic process in your decision-making that centers voices that are going to be closest to the work, including for those of us, many in philanthropy, who have come directly from being grantees, come from being movement leaders? When we step onto the funder side, we are one step removed. And to understand your role and understand that dynamic and power, that you are, again, not on the front line. You are directly in partnership and trying to be in solidarity and support. But what does that do? And so then what should that be reflected in your decision-making structures? I think part of the attack is obviously to dismantle infrastructure, ethos, the values, and especially relationships and creativity. I think I saw this brought up a couple times in the chat. And so to me, the direct answer to that is to continue on, I think, what has already been gaining momentum of philanthropy looking at its processes. I don't want to, particularly after this movement, return to a 2-decade-old approach of a really top-down heavy philanthropy. I think it's a both-and situation. And so I think part of that is allowing ourselves to be steadfast in the fact that we have been making process also in our approaches, and we shouldn't just give them up when we're under attack. And if anything, move backwards. And I also have to say, there's something I hear time and time again from community, is it's when folks have worked on building relationships and then retreat, that is the biggest way to dismantle trust very, very quickly. And we know how long it takes to build trust. And we often say on my team, you're often in philanthropy first dismantling distrust because of all the oppressive systems in history that we've already named. And so to do the opposite of that, to say, I'm going to take a step in some way to make a clear, intentional, and pragmatic approach to centering community voices in some part of my work, if not all of it, is a cue back to community to say, I have not let up on this, that this is the approach. I just think that systems change is not just in our systems of government, it is in our systems of our institutions. And that might be to Edgar's point about why is it a spiritual piece that we're losing. I literally think it's also, if you're not practicing the idea of democracy on a daily basis, how much are you actually saying you're committed and believe it? I think that's really, really important. I think that everybody can find a way. It doesn't just matter about your grant make it. Is it in your research? Is it in your methods? Is it in your advocacy? There are so many ways to democratize the decision making to folks who are closer to harm. So that's, I think, a lot. I think I hopefully answered your question. And then I think, obviously, when you fund community-led work, you always practice the muscle of solidarity. And so I think philanthropy, I think was also mentioned in the chat. It's not just that Donald Trump and that movement had a lot of money. It was highly organized. It was connected to each other. We, on the other side, on progressive and leftist, I think our problem is that we are so siloed. We just say, you go off and do that, I go off and do that. And so part of the attack of dismantling relationships and coalitions and philanthropy that we've finally been starting to build is if they are successful at that, that is going to hurt all of us. And so when you're working with community-led funds, when you fund something, you start to model it because that's inevitable, right? So you fund building ecosystems, coalitions, you start to collaborate, you start to be transparent, you start to be very clear of your limitations. This is one of the things I think is most important in participatory decision-making builds. You have to be clear about the guardrails that are maybe outside of your scope or your strategy. And often, if you have not had to explain those externally, and we keep most of those things internally or behind closed doors, you actually never have to interrogate the assumptions underneath them to negotiate them with other folks and be able to, I think, to Carmen's point about being being honest about transactional approaches to say, this is my limitation, this is how I function. And community can then go say, great, I've mapped you in this role here, and I can find and slot in other people's on my coalition where I need them to be at. I think that goes back to, I think I heard Ashley talk about that earlier about how people are fitting into the coalition. And I think that's one of the biggest things that we're also missing. I hope that the threats are actually an opportunity for us to double down on things that we know we've been missing.
You have such a very practiced way, right, and approach. It's one clarifying to sort of a relief. And I wonder, I mean, have you pivoted at all? Like, or has something popped out to you as the aha, right? Either you're doubling down because you've seen, or you've shifted even within that very practiced approach.
We haven't pivoted at all because I think another part, I think I mentioned it earlier about in like and how to practice this muscle of solidarity. It's identifying your privilege and power in every space. So I, as a person of color who's not Black and Muslim, if I find in my community anti-Blackness, I have to do the work to interrogate that and fight against that. And conversely, my Christian brothers and sisters, if they see Islamophobia in their communities, they speak to that. And so that's how I also see we reflect that in our work and in our day-to-day. So if I'm talking with if we all code switch, but if I'm talking with funders facing work, I'm interrogating, is this actually a risk? Is centering lived experiences voices over the voices you currently center, because you have to center something, is that actually a legal risk? It's not. And then this is the conversation. You have to hold people in these moments. It's a relational approach. You have to say, let's talk that through. Let's walk you off a cliff there. Let's hold anxiety. I think it's also in terms of power and privilege. As I mentioned, it's about who has to hold the labor of that anxiety for folks. I want to shield, for example, my community, my grantees from that level of anxiety and philanthropy that I think is happening. And then I think to the aha moment about the practice of it, something I was recently in North Carolina with Dr. Tressie McMillan Cottom, who I love. And she said, people are asking, like, what are you doing? And she's like, you continue the work, of course. And it means do something, do it with other people, and do it again. And that's, to me, synthesizing the approach here, which is to do your work, do with other people farther from your immediate circle, and do it again and again and again. And I do think that is what is the successful approach on the right, outside of just how much money they're moving. I think it's about that. The commitment to doing something, doing it with other people, and doing it again and again and again. That is a coalition that gets built. I think I answered your question.
You sure did. You sure did. At the end, I'll give you the preview, right? We're going to look for those kinds of like call to actions. So you just gave us a massive call to action. That's actually very simple and elegant. So you get the challenge to think of another call to action, but that was incredible. Thank you. I have to ask you for the very hard thing, which is I think we can squeeze in one more round of questions if we move quickly. So it's dependent on you all. If you can answer really in a little bit of a shorter time frame, I'm sorry to put that on you. Edgar, I want to ask you, you have said this, right? And your research shows the most affluent donors are giving based on their own personal values rather than community defined priorities. So, how can foundations prevent that kind of like personal or ideological preference, boards, living donors, and from overriding the expertise of what Monica just talked about?
Yeah, a good question. Philanthropy was really designed to center the preferences of donors in so many ways. And I think that there are ways to sort of get around that. And one, as we've already said, like we move money into the hands of folks, shift that decision-making power. We have a donor community called Liberty Capital, 800 members, and it's been an experiment since 2019 where folks, we pull money, we're able to fund really radical work, and no one in that community makes any decisions about where money goes. And it's very much sort of a reparations-based model. And I say to the folks there all the time that, oh, we're all donors, and there's something around like just shifting what donor means. Like historically, it means a donor is a person who makes decisions and decides about where money goes. We're reframing that to be like a donor is just we're all donors. We all give all the time, and now we can be in this community to liberate these resources and talk about other things like to work at being better human beings. But practically, I think what we're seeing, we've worked with a number of organizations who are shifting governance. And so, when we see a large number of philanthropies being family foundations who completely have family members on the board, making and calling all the shots. There's a trend to see more folks inviting community members onto those boards, and so that's a very easy way to kind of democratize at some level. Where right now we're seeing 90% of boards sort of being made up of wealthy donors who invite their friends. And so when we can bring community into the governance level of foundations, if we're not going to just give all the money away, which is my preference, we can definitely look at shifting the governance models and not putting folks on as advisors, as tokens, as consultants, but full-fledged decision-making board members. And so that's one thing that actually we see some work happening there. I think also we've raised these ideas of participatory grant making, which we're a really big fan of. All of our funds are participatory, led by community members, and I think there's just it's become a fad of philanthropy that to move money in this way. I think we have to just be careful that it doesn't become performative, right? It's easy to throw some organizers in the room, use their street cred to like move this money in a certain way, but we have to really make sure we're not becoming performative in it, and that we are really ceding power. And honestly, in our funds, there's times where, our community folks make decisions where I'm like, oh gosh, I don't know if I would have made that decision, or I know this other group over there, and I really think that they should get, and I have to just sit back because we are really practicing ceding that power in a real way to folks who are making those decisions, who come from those movements. And so yeah, I think that's really sort of the heart of
Yeah.
it here, is that we have to be willing to cede power, and that's hard for folks to do who have power.
Yeah. No, I mean, this is all, again, you've said it so simply, both of you, just in that little exchange, and it is hard to do. So thank you for again, it's just clarity of purpose. Carmen, I want to come to you next, and you mentioned something, and so I'm going to like reference it in order to maybe cut to the chase a little quicker. We talked a lot, and I saw one of our friends who was on the September conversation we had with Equity Matters. Her name is Dr. Khalila Harris, and she's the ED of the Public Justice Center up in Maryland, Baltimore. And we were talking at the time about organizations that are federally funded, for example, right, rely on public dollars, are service provider community facing because they're service providers, and a lot of pressure to prematurely scrub materials, right? Like maybe even, back off of work that they know is important to the outcomes that they're seeking. Anyway, and you made mention of, it's way more than that, right? This is not just about pre-compliance, about language. And so question I want to pose to you, Carmen, is how do we actually support these smaller, vulnerable organizations who are the ones that are dependent on federal state funding, contracts? They they cannot easily or endure maybe the retaliation or risk for retaliation. And, what are the kind of practical, structural, protective roles that philanthropy can play in helping them to stay anchored in their purpose and really safeguard their communities?
Yeah, so I think Ashley's earlier point again, and this is going to be the third time that I say it, is that I think she's really right that the sort of the entry point of attack is overwhelmingly and most likely to be trying to get you because your papers aren't right. So you don't have an audit. So I think if you're a foundation on this call, actually having very honest conversations with your grant recipients about sort of their operational standing, what infrastructure they need, do they need an audit, like to try to figure those things out and to be as honest as possible. I think the other thing is, in this moment, we need people who are willing and able to take bold and creative actions against the state. And I don't think it's enough to provide money to support bigger actions. I think we have to provide our grant recipients as a funder sort of continued support. So, should you decide to take direct public action? Should you organize a protest? Should you actually lean on your constitutionally protected rights and test them out in public? I think organizations need to know that you're going to have their back if they decide to do that. And I think this can happen across organizations. So one of the things that has been so interesting is what feels like organizations suffering in silence. Like they will get a letter, they will we've had organizations targeted when Musk was leading Doge, sort of targeting them on social media. And then what happens is that the organization feels isolated and alone. And so, what does it mean just to reach out and say, hey, I saw this thing happen. I don't know you, but I'm with you. That's all you have to do. The number of people that brings that creates courage, right? Like the fact that people have your back is a medicine, right? It's a salve for loneliness in this moment. And that's what they want for us to feel. I think the second thing for that funders can do, but again, that I think we can all do, is actually move into the communications fray. Like, don't let these conversations happen without your voice being there. And, right now, the thing that I feel like is front of mind for me is all of the language around Antifa. We should all be anti-fascist. I'm just going to say that right now. We should all be Antifa. Every day, if I had a button, I would be wearing it. We should all be wearing that button and not actually imagining that like the only anti-fascists are black bloc organizers, that there are people who are fundamentally anti-fascist because fascism is fucked up, right? And it's okay to say that. I think letting sort of that communications and the narrative conversation be dominated by forces who don't have our best interests, that don't have our community best interests in mind, is a great failure, I think, of philanthropy, but more broadly of the sector. And then lastly, I started with this, so I'll end with this. I think asking your funders, and if you have any relationship, if you're on a foundation board, if you work at a foundation, understanding where your endowment is invested is really important. So most foundations give out 5%. That means 95% of your resources could be working at cross counter purposes to your mission and grant making. And I think that there is a governing responsibility to make sure that there's alignment. I think that there's a societal responsibility to make sure there's alignment. But most importantly, I feel like there's a human imperative to make sure that there's alignment. So if on the endowment, if you're out here talking about, I want democracy everywhere, but your endowment is invested in Meta or Tesla, then you have a problem. If on the programmatic side, you're trying to reimagine the criminal punishment system, and on your investment side, you're invested in the Geo Group, you have a real problem. I think one of the things that has stuck with me since our announcement to give out more money this year, I'll say two things. One is that the shock has been mostly from philanthropy. Like, how did you do it? We have this money in the bank. If this is an urgent problem, why wouldn't we spend it? That just seems why would we get a loan from a financial institution that's screwing over our communities to do it? We have this money. Why wouldn't we spend it? So that was the first thing. The second thing, our endowment ended last year down. It ended down at $850 million. We just got a report this year. We gave out an extra $100 million this year. Our endowment this year is ending at $800 million. So if people tell you in philanthropy, how do you do it? It's a magic miracle. It turns out capitalism really works if you're really rich. It just like, aha, you knew that shit before, but now you know that I know that shit for real, for real. And like I feel like we can't be afraid or imagine that endowment conversations are somehow like extra math. Like you have to know trigonometry to talk about endowments. You don't. It's like plus minus. That's really what it is. And I feel like more and more people who are committed to the programmatic work of our institutions need to be equally invested in the like endowment and investment work. And we can't be afraid of math. That is my going away point is do not be afraid of math.
I think you have a lot of points that folks are taking away. All right. Unfortunately, we are like near the very end. My colleague Tom has been chatting. If everybody can please like click the link to the survey so that you can give us, Carmen for president, you can give us, so, I can't watch the chat. It's very distracting and amazing. Open the survey link so that you can give us some feedback. I'm going to guess the number one feedback is going to be we need a part two to this conversation. So think about it. But I want to pose a last question to each of you in sort of a lightning round way. And maybe let me ask this one to Damien, Ashley specifically. And then I'll pose another one to Edgar and Monica and Carmen. So Damien and Ashley, if you could equip participants with one concrete action to defend racial economic justice and strengthen our multiracial democracy through philanthropy, what would it be and why? So equip participants with one concrete action to defend and strengthen our multiracial democracy through philanthropy.
I saw Ashley's finger point at the screen, so I'll take the lead. But I'll first say that Carmen, if you had a church, I would be a member. Carmen for president, 2026.
That's a big compliment.
But as far as recommendations go, I was just in a conversation with someone I was recently introduced to. His name is Marcus Littles with the Frontline Solutions, and one of the things that we shared in conversation was this idea of making dreaming a discipline. And that would be what I would offer. I think that there is a lot of space and opportunity to do some visioning work that positions us to imagine a future that we don't yet see. And part of the what we've seen as the kind of power on the side of those who are anti-democracy and not for kind of equal access to opportunity and rights is that they have a vision, which they're making very clear and apparent. And I think equally we need to have a vision. And I think it's been mentioned across the panelists that we can't punch down that potential. And so if I had anything to offer, it would be make dreaming a discipline.
I agree. And what keeps coming forward for me is like model it, like model the future that we say we believe is possible. Um, Solidarity is free. It doesn't cost us anything. I actually can just stand in support of folks who need, like it is actually free. And so maybe since I saved time on that, one of the questions that I saw lifted up was, what does it mean to work in service of folks who would destroy us? While I think it sounds noble, I struggle with this framing. This is actually the same answer I just gave. We have to model something different. And I want to be really clear, like I absolutely get it. My commitment to an all consciousness gets tested very often. My ankles buckle, I get weak in the knees by some of the behavior that I see that is even directed towards me personally, in those moments, I turn my attention to other global examples, post-apartheid South Africa, Germany, but I want us to be careful. Those moments, what I've learned from my own self in this journey is that whenever I revert to an us versus them framework and stance, I take on the very behaviors that I'm working against. And so it feels important that we have to start modeling the very thing that feels impossible.
There are many churches that I would start going to. That was incredible. I'm looking back at my notes. There's something you said at the beginning about the vision of the all, and I can't find it quick enough. But oh shucks, I'll think if I think of it in the end. Let me pose a last question then to Monica and Carmen and Edgar. How can philanthropy really foster this kind of cross-movement solidarity that Ashley just so beautifully talked about, that actually like disrupts the zero-sum funding and the competition for limited resources, and really like just reinforces that manufactured divide that is being put upon us? So how can philanthropy foster cross-movement solidarity and avoid that zero-summing?
I'll just sort of to tack on to Ashley is model it. Like if we want a multiracial democracy, we need multiracial organizations, we need to fund multiracial organizing. You have to be as committed to rural Appalachia as you are to Chicago. You have to be as committed to, you have to be as, again, 70% of Americans. And I feel like for me, one of the disciplining factors is, in this moment where it's really quick, it's really easy to be like, man, white people really let us down. Or Latinos, like, yeah, I'll just speak about my own cousins. Latinos really let us down. What I also know is that Latinos are suffering. If 70% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck, then I know that 80% of Latinos are living paycheck to paycheck. And I know that people are making very rational decisions, and neither party in this past election uh, offered a meaningful intervention for that suffering. One actually offered a hateful intervention, hate as the intervention, but one offered no intervention. And we have to be honest about that. And I feel like we confuse like really rich white people with poor white people, and we throw them in the same bucket. And I'm not trying to do that. I'm clear that there's one person, Elon Musk, has as much wealth as 52% of Americans. Just think about that. One person, millions of Americans. That's the person who I actually want to hold accountable. That's the person who's pickpocketing us. And my knees don't get weak when I think about holding Elon Musk accountable, but I think we have to be able to make a distinction between him and the Walmart worker, between him and the Amazon driver. We have to have greater discipline about who our us is, and our us is so much bigger when we're open to it.
Monica or Edgar?
I'll jump in just to say practicing that muscle of solidarity is continuing to build meaningful relationships. That's what our communities, that's part of why funding communities work so well, is because they understand the human as a holistic whole being, and the work of repair and healing. If we're talking about capitalist structures, it is more than just money. It is about social capital as well. It is about all the other ways that we support each other, because we know that folks do a lot of work without having much money to move. With all philanthropists, including those at any level, and a lot of what their support is money and also their social capital. And I was reminded of it by folks who are in reparations movement in California or Illinois. They were saying it wasn't just about moving the money for reparations for that healing. It was about how they did it, how they made people feel, and the relationships they built alongside the way.
Sure. I'll just jump in and say, yeah, we think a lot about solidarity as an organization for 7 years that's been funding and working in Indigenous and Black communities. And I think, and then what is the role of funders and all of that? And so Really, what was just said by Monica, we see the need for a lot of truth telling, repair, and not allowing solidarity within philanthropy to become sort of this new buzzword, right? That we're moving on to, where we're forcing folks into these situations to work together, to play together, or whatever. But really also putting our own skin in the game and understanding that solidarity is just not some interesting strategy. It is like critical and necessary for multiracial democracy. And that means that philanthropy itself has to be willing to make bold moves and to publicly come out and support, to defend their grantees, as things have been said here. So it's moving the money in a way that is very, very different. I think philanthropy has contributed to the silos by the way that we fund. So there's lots of ways to get around that we can talk about. But it's also going beyond sort of just writing the checks, but being willing to actually, stand in the line of fire when it comes down to it. So grantees know that they're really supported. I've joked around with some of my funders, like, hey, if they pick me up at the airport, y'all gonna come get me, right? Like, y'all are y'all watching? I don't have the funding for the legal infrastructure and the security and all the types of things that we need. And so philanthropy can actually show that in solidarity with their partners, and then also just create and fund in ways that it's going to foster that organic type of solidarity. I think in community movements may appear to not have the solidarity that we want them to have sometimes because they just aren't resourced to do it. Collaboration takes money. It takes that glue funding, we used to call it, to allow for those things to happen. But it's not going to happen if we kind of force them and throw them into networks because we think it's a good strategy. But model it, as we said on this call, like model what being a good funding partner is. Put your reputation as a donor, as a foundation on the line by getting on television, as some foundations had, and publicly condemning, and organize other foundations to do the same, using that power and privilege that we have in this industry for the sake of the grantee partners who may not have that, but are every single day have been, but putting their lives and reputations and everything they have on the lines for our democracy.
Yeah, thank you so much. I remember how I felt when I saw the op-ed, I'm not sure what format it was, with 100 of foundations, you folks who are on, and many others, to actually sign your name, right? That you're going to stand with those folks in the field who are putting it on the line. It mattered. And Ashley, the moment I was thinking about was that you had said, as we were preparing for the conversation, about this is a nation building movement. And just so many threads from this conversation about how we need to model differently helps me to understand really what the whole of what you're talking about when you're calling all in, and that this is a nation building movement. So I'm gonna do my best to wrap us up. Everybody stayed on the line. Folks who were chatting, like, please feel free to say your last things in the chat. It's been really incredible conversation and feedback throughout. I just want to thank our speakers for your deep and meaningful reflections today. Thank you for everybody to come to this space and engage with honesty and urgency and a lot of moral clarity. I want to thank the CLASP team who really pulled this together, our communications team, our development team, but also importantly, our racial equity team. And each of you, thank you for making this conversation possible, and the partners who really shaped today's conversation. Before I close, I just want to extend a special thanks to Alan Curtis and the Milton Eisenhower Foundation for your longstanding leadership in helping to advance racial and economic justice, and, to Damien's point, right, an anti-Black racism stance, and for strengthening our multiracial democracy. Your partnership in today's conversation is especially appreciated. Today, one thing was made really crystal clear. Philanthropy is at this inflection point, and we heard how political backlash is actively trying to reshape the field and narrowing what funders believe is quote unquote safe, increasing scrutiny in grant making, pressuring organizations to back away from the very commitments that define our justice work. But we also very loudly, clearly heard why a moment like this demands courage, how each of you are demonstrating it, how important alignment is, and solidarity, and just an unwavering commitment in communities that are most harmed by injustice. And acknowledging the leadership needs to come from there. Each of you have reminded us that we have to ground philanthropic decisions in lived experience and community governance, in the leadership of those that are closest to injustice. We've got to resist the urge to sanitize or obscure our equity commitments. Erasing language doesn't erase inequity and injustice. We've got to build long-term infrastructure. Lots of you talked about that, not short-term projects or programs. We have to expect that movements and communities will be able to weather these political storms. And we've got to protect, the smaller nonprofits. I'm still thinking about what you said, Carmen, about the redirect that you've made in the practice at your foundation, but protecting smaller nonprofits, those that are, really suffering because of the federal funding cuts and aren't in the position, right, to risk maybe as much as some of the rest of us can, and not letting them be isolated in this moment. We heard what it means to translate complexity into really just useful, simplistic, simple, elegant. Monica, I'm hearing your words now, right? The practice that you have really embedded and brought to light, and which others are also practicing. Turning data into stories, documenting mitigating harm in real time, strengthening coalitions, strengthening collaborations across sectors in order to really push back, defend against what's happening. And so this really is our collective call to action. Every one of us, we're working in philanthropy, or we're working in policy or research. All the folks who have joined advocacy, community organizing, every one of us has a role to play in resisting this coercion, really naming the truth, resourcing justice with a level of urgency that is required in this moment. So as we close out, I just want to thank you again and invite you to ask yourself, what responsibility will you carry forward from today? Is it amplifying community voice? Is it shifting decision-making power? Is it resourcing movement infrastructure? Is it protecting those who are under threat? Or taking a public risk when silence would be so much easier? So thank you again for joining us. Please take a minute, complete the survey, and I encourage you to join us for future Equity Matters conversations as we continue to really build our alignment, right, and resist the harm and really strengthen our multiracial democracy for generations to come. So thank you again. Take good care. Take a good rest of your day. Take care.
Thanks all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah. Talk to you soon.
Thank you. Great to see you, Carmen.
Ashley, you're the best. I'm not gonna say anything because I know there are a lot of people on this call, but I want to do a giant heart to you. I don't know how that works
Right
on the
back at you.
internet. Look at that. I'm gonna do little balloons going to you, lightning. You're just absolutely my fave. I love being in the same place with you. I always learn a lot. I know there are a bunch of people here, but I also want to tell you, um, there are so many ways that I love being in relationship with you. And one of them is that I always feel a little bit uncomfortable.
I second that. That's not.
And I just feel like that is how we should be. We should be able to love
Wait,
and to be like, oh, I'm actually, and I feel I just said this to Michael, like, uh, you should be able to love, like, this is how you love the normal people in your life, right? Like, this is how I love my partner. This, like,
yeah, like your
there's like
family
a little
members.
space. There's like a little space, and you're like, oh, you think that way? You're not like me in everything. That's yuck. And
It
then
turns out we're
when
supposed
you
to stretch each
grow,
other.
oh gosh, when you grow, Ashley, it is just a gift. And every time I hear you, yeah, every time I get to hear you reflect on your work and reflect on Policy Link's work, one is like the amazing discipline it takes
Mm.
to actually have a clarity about building a new us, like building
Mm.
new governing institutions. That's like not an ancient thing. That's like some real shit, And I just have to tell you, um, yeah, I am so much better for you. That's what I want to tell you. I am so much better for you and the work you're doing. I just want to tell you that. And sometimes it's, mm, mm.
I'm working to receive what you said. People keep saying you have to learn how to just say thank you.
Yeah, good.
But what I need to say is um, I appreciate the same stretching.
Mm,
Like we're supposed to be in relationships that stretch us and grow
totally.
us and like make us squirm, and I'm grateful for it. So just I receive
Yeah,
what you said, but I need you to hear what I said too.
I hear it. I thank you. Yeah, I'm so grateful. I'm so grateful. Thanks, Wendy.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you
Thank you.
both for
To
letting
That
us.
was like the
everyone.
after cuts.
I
The
know,
what
no,
is
thank
it?
you
Like the
for
deep
sharing
cuts.
that.
I
Thank you
love
for sharing
staying
that.
after in the Zoom to see who's like the Zoom. I'm a Zoom lurker.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank
Yeah,
you
no,
all.
thank you both.
Bye, y'all.
Yeah, hope to see you soon.